Welcome back to the Bible study journey. Today, we continue our deep dive into the book of Genesis with chapter 6, a passage that is just packed with human struggle, impatience, pain, and a surprising moment where God reveals himself in a deeply personal way as the God who sees. Let's get into it. Genesis 16 opens with a difficult reality. Sarai is still without children. God has made this incredible promise of descendants as numerous as the stars. But years have gone by, and from her perspective, nothing has changed. And like so many of us, Sarai wrestles with waiting. She starts to think, maybe this isn't going to happen the way I thought. Maybe I need to do something about this myself. Her frustration quickly turns into a plan. Sarai goes to her husband Abram and says, "Go sleep with my servant Hagar. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Now, this was a common cultural practice in the ancient world, a sort of legal surrogacy, but it was never a part of God's perfect plan. Instead of waiting on God's timing and trusting his method, Sarai tries to fix God's promise with a human solution. Abram agrees to the plan, and Hagar becomes pregnant. But instead of solving their problem, it unleashes a whole host of new ones. The moment Hagar conceives, the dynamic in the household shatters. She begins to look down on her mistress, Sarai. Pride enters the picture. Sarai, filled with anger and jealousy, then blames Abram for the situation she created. Abram, trying to avoid the conflict, essentially tells Sarai to handle it however she sees fit, and Sarai deals with Hagar. So harshly so, cruelly that Hagar runs away, fleeing into the barren wilderness. Everything that was supposed to make life easier has now made it infinitely worse. This chapter is such a powerful reminder. When we take God's promises into our own hands, we often end up creating more pain and confusion. But here, in the middle of this tragic story, we find one of the most beautiful and tender moments in all of Genesis. Hagar is completely alone. She's pregnant, rejected, and emotionally broken. And it is in this desperate place that the angel of the Lord finds her by a spring of water in the desert. He calls her by name. "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?" Think about that. God sees her. God knows her name. And God meets her exactly where she is not, in the comfort of a palace, but in the desolation of the desert. The angel then gives Hagar a promise of her own. He tells her to return and submit to Sarai. But he also tells her that God will multiply her descendants beyond number. She will have a son, and she is to name him Ishmael, which literally means God hears. Why? Because God heard her misery. God saw her suffering. He knew her pain. Hagar's response to this encounter is profound. She gives God a new name, one of the few times this happens in Scripture. She says, "You are the God who sees me." In Hebrew, El Harui, the God who sees me. Even in her absolute lowest moment, when she felt invisible and forgotten by everyone else, she realized that God was there, watching over her with compassion. So, Hagar returns, and Ishmael is born. Abram is 86 years old. And just as God promised, Ishmael will become the father of a great nation. This chapter definitely sets the stage for future conflict between the descendants of Ishmael and Isaac, who will be born later. But it also powerfully reminds us that God's compassion extends to everyone, even those who have been pushed to the margins, forgotten, or cast aside by society. So, what are the big lessons we can take from Genesis? First, waiting on God is often the hardest part of faith, but his timing is always better than our quick-fix solutions. Second, our human shortcuts often create long, painful spiritual detours. Third, and this is so important, God sees the unnoticed. If you feel invisible today, if you feel like no one understands what you're going through, know this. El Orai, the God who sees you. Fourth, God hears the hurting. Your prayers, your tears, your fears, none of them go unheard. And finally, God's faithfulness continues even when we fail. Sarai and Abram made a mess, but God's plan wasn't derailed. Thank you so much for studying Genesis chapter 16 with us here on the Bible Study Journey. If this message encouraged you today, be sure to like the video, Comment below with your biggest takeaway, and subscribe so you can follow along as we continue our journey through the book of Genesis. We'll see you next time.